And then I will mute everybody and except Jerry. Jerry, please unmute yourself. Can I do unmute?
Yep,
Okay,
unmuted.
thank you. So, Jerry, please say a few words about yourself before your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning from where I am in Guangdong in China. I live in a city called Zhongshan, which is quite famous. It's quite small, but it's the home of Sun Yat-sen, and everybody knows Sun Yat-sen was the kind of founder of the Republic of China, and well regarded still, even in the PRC, the People's Republic of China. I've lived here for 20 years. I came in 2004. Very simply, I came here to be a teacher of English, and my life developed. I'm now retired. I'm married in China, and as I say, I've 20 years now, more than 20 years. I'm in the process of applying for permanent residency. And what I do in China now, since I retired about 6 years ago, I started a social media site. I have was Twitter, now X. I have 88,000 followers there. And I have a YouTube channel called Jerry's Take on China with 45,000 followers. And basically, what I try and do is I try and correct the misperceptions, the misunderstandings, and the clearly misinformation about China. So that's really what I do. So as far as why I'm here is just to talk to you guys about China and my own experiences. I have cycled across China 3 times. I'm planning another trip in about 2 months' time to cycle from Guangdong to Mongolia. But my first trip was from Guangdong to the border of Kazakhstan, which I can see behind your head there, where Urumqi is. We went 600 kilometers. Yeah, you don't have to move. I can see Xinjiang quite clearly, and I know it very, very well, having cycled across the deserts there and through Lop Nor and the camel sanctuaries. And I mean, basically, I've come to know China from the ground by cycling across it. I've also, and I can see Harbin there. I've cycled from Harbin to Guangzhou, or to Zhongshan, actually, to Guangdong. And these are just trips that I've taken several months on a bike. I've got about 50,000 kilometers of cycling under my belt inside of China, and we'll add another 5 to 10,000 kilometers this year doing the same thing, going up to Mongolia. So that's who I am.
Very interesting. So, I understand you originally is from UK and then you moved to Australia. Is that right?
That's correct. I grew up in the northeast of England. My family moved to the southeast when I was 13. Just entering my teens. My family moved me with a Geordie accent to East London or Essex, and I found myself a little bit of a misfit because of my broad northern accent. I talk like that, and they would really treated me quite badly. The girls loved it and the boys hated it. I used to get beaten up at school for having this strange accent that the girls enjoyed. I joined the police when I was 18 years of age in the Metropolitan Police in the UK. I served on diplomatic protection, royalty protection, and something called the Force Support Unit, which was the group of guys who went to places like all of the National Front riots, the protests, the race riots of Brixton and Toxteth. And I served on the miners' strike. I spent 13 weeks in the north of England on the miners' strike. And basically, that's what changed my perception of the job I was doing because my grandfather was a coal miner and I was working on Margaret Thatcher's Blue Line, fighting the people that I'd kind of grown up amongst. And it caused a bit of a contradiction in my brain. I didn't like, and so my wife at the time, who was an Australian citizen, said, "Well, why don't we just go home? England's getting worse than it used to be, and we should just go home." And home for her was Sydney. So we moved to Australia, and I lived 17 years in Australia before coming to China. I lived 6 years in Sydney, 7 years in Brisbane, and a couple of years in Adelaide as well. I found Adelaide to be the most enjoyable city. I like wine.
You missed Melbourne.
I've been to Melbourne hundreds of times, but I didn't miss living there. I didn't really enjoy Melbourne as a place to live. I know there'll be a lot of people upset by that, but for me, it's Sydney was a great place. Adelaide was a great place, and I
Yeah.
enjoyed my time in Brisbane too. So I'm sure if I'd lived there, I would have enjoyed it just as
I
much.
also like Adelaide. Very
Mm,
beautiful city and
yeah.
very relaxing.
Yes.
Okay, a little bit about your. I believe your trip, bicycle trip to Xinjiang is solo. Is that right?
No, the first trip was two foreigners, myself and a guy from Ireland, Phil Bean. He and I, he had a different motivation. I was raising money for charity and also wanted to have a ride across China. He is a photojournalist and he wanted to photograph people in their native environments all through China. And there's no better way of doing it than traveling slowly through on a bike and stopping in corner stores in the middle of nowhere and taking pictures of people. So he created, when we finished the ride, he created a coffee table book about his travels through China, and we sold that for charity. Actually, half the pictures in it were mine, but he did the work. He was a professional photojournalist and did a great job. Unfortunately, it was never available for general sale. It doesn't have an ISBN number. It was just sold for our charity purposes. So there's a few hundred copies out there and maybe a couple of thousand copies in total, and that's all. But if anyone wants one, I can get them one. They'd have to come to China to pick it up, though, because I can't post books out of China.
Is you can't post books out China?
No, the
I don't
Chinese,
know.
if it's a Chinese printed book with an ISBN, there's not a problem. But if it's a book they think maybe it's just one of these political things that they have. There's certain things you can't post. Medicine's another one. I mean, you can do it if you have the ability. If I go through a company, I could probably do it. But as a personal basis, no, I can't get books sent in and I can't get books sent out.
Unless the book has an ISBN.
Yeah, if it's an approved Chinese publication, there are two different ISBNs, international and Chinese. To sell a book in China, you need a Chinese ISBN. To sell a book in the rest of the world, you really need an international ISBN. They're not hard to get. It's just something we've never bothered to do.
Okay, so I think there are people in our group um, questioning whether what we heard in the Western media, for example, about Xinjiang, is correct or not. And since you have been to Xinjiang, what is your observation there? Is that the reaction camp, all that? I know there's
Okay,
crap, but from your perspective,
perhaps a good word. Um, I would say I particularly read Australian media, and I would say that for every single story, there is 2% of truth, 98% of either misinformation or misinterpretation. And I'm going to be generous here and say that a lot of it is misunderstanding. A lot of people don't understand China, but then there are a lot of people who are in positions of some degree of public prominence who are paid to misinform us. A great example is ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. They are paid to misinform the Australian public. And it's as simple as that. And it's been proven time and time again. There's a person who works within that organization. His name is Nathan Russa. Nathan was a 20-something-year-old, unqualified undergraduate who got a job as an intern. And he's the guy who identified all of these camps. Now, I've cycled past the camps. Now, let's be honest, Xinjiang has 24 million people. It's a very large place. As you can see from the map behind you, it is a very large place. It's bigger than Germany and Spain added together, and it has 24 million people. So when someone says to me, but look, here's a prison, my comment to that is, so? Of course, they have prisons. They have 24 million people. Australia has 26 million people and has 142 prisons. Why are there no prisons in Xinjiang? Because there's 24 million people live there. Of course, they have criminals and they put some of those criminals into prisons. That's a fact, and I'll accept that fact. So there's the 2% truth. But then you've got these places that have dormitories and canteens and workstations, and they have fences around the outside, and they have guard posts on the front gate, and they're factories or they're schools. And these are the misunderstandings and misinterpretations. Anyone who comes to China, and this is something, and you would know this, but anybody who comes to China and looks at a school can see that outside of the school, at the gate, there is a security checkpoint. There are police officers on duty. Around the school, there is a wall, and that wall has barbed wire on the top. That is to keep the children safe, not to keep them contained. This is not a prison. This is a safe environment for children to go to school and be protected. And that is the purpose. So there's a misunderstanding, there's a misinterpretation. And then I have people, particularly American people, who say, I wouldn't want my kids going to school past police officers. Police officers are terrible people, and we don't want the kids frightened. Well, that's a misunderstanding of culture, because in China, the people here respect the police. They have no trouble. They're like the police when I joined in 1977, and people would say, "Oh, you're a police officer. That's good." Now people say, "You're a police officer." Oh, I'll back off, because it's frightening to be a police officer for some people. In China, the kids love the police. They know that the police are the people who will look after you. I've got a statistic here, and this is one that I've used a few times, which stuns many people. In the United States, the police kill somebody every 7 hours. In China, on average, the police kill one person every 7 years. That's a fact. There have been, in the last 8 years, there has been one person shot by the police in China, killed by the police. In America, every 24 hours, on average, 3.7 people are killed by the police. So that tells you why they have a different culture. They're afraid of their police. And in China, they're not afraid of their police. So there's the difference. And the argument that I've had with people in ASPI is that they don't understand China. They're not Chinese. They have no idea of the culture and what is really happening there. Every factory, every school has a fence around it. The guys wear uniforms when they go to work, and they march from their dormitories into the canteen, from the canteen to the workstation, from the workstation. And they're not marching, of course. They're just in groups going from one place to another. So this is watched on satellite cameras by people like this young man, Nathan Rusa, and misunderstood. The same guy thought that a QR code, which is how we pay for everything, was a tracking system so that the police could track Xinjiang residents and where they're going and who they're interacting with. And he put that on Twitter. He got absolutely lambasted by the Twitter population who understand China. This is how we pay our bills. This is what we use to pay. Everything is done on the telephone now, and we scan that QR code to pay bills. So he misunderstood something there. I mean, the whole thing starts with misunderstanding, but when they're paid to misinform, there's a very different situation. And people accuse me of being paid all the time. And the reason they accuse me is because many of them are being paid to do what they do. And I'm just simply building a following by telling the truth.
Talking about this misinformation, I think there was a huge uh, backlash when United States tried to ban TikTok. So
Yes.
we have a TikTok refugees coming to the Little Red Book. Have
Yep.
your audience also talk about how they feel after contacting um, people in China through the Red Book?
Generally
Any
speaking,
experience?
my audience are people like yourself. They know. And most of the people who follow me because they realize that I'm actually telling the truth, and they want to know what China is really like. I'll make a video about the democratic process and how this works in China. And people are beginning to understand that China is not what they thought it was. Even Chinese diaspora are realizing that China that they or their parents left 20, 30, 50 years ago is not the China of today. I think when I get comments on my YouTube videos or on my Twitter, I would say that more than 99% of the comments are positive comments. They already know, and they're thanking me for pointing out something that they've just learned. You know, a lot of people learn about their own country from me. Many of my followers are Chinese named people, and many of them are second, third, or fourth generation non-Chinese citizens. So they're coming from Canada, America, Australia, and they're coming here. Many of them visit me and say, "Thank you for showing me around." You know, I show them around the place. You know, take them out, have dinner somewhere, have a yum cha, and they can see for themselves that what I'm saying is true. This is the benefit of the Xiaohongshu, the little red book or red note,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
Xiaohongshu over here. The benefit of this and Australia has this, the 30-day visa-free visit. So you can digitally visit China and you can physically visit China now to see for yourself. So this has been an enormous benefit to people who are doing what I do. It's extremely difficult to prove me wrong when tens of thousands of people are visiting either digitally or in reality and seeing for themselves. The people who have an open mind are looking at China and going, wow, it wasn't what I expected. I mean, I said that on my first day here 20 years ago. It wasn't what I expected. It has got better and better over the years. When I came here, it was quite corrupt. It was quite dirty. It was definitely a very poor quality environment to live in terms of the air quality. That has all changed. And it is now 100% turned around. It is now Zhongshan has cleaner air than Sydney, and yet it has 4 million people living here and is in the center of the greatest manufacturing hub in the world, but it has cleaner air than Sydney and London. So, how does that happen? Because of the electric vehicles, because of the air filtration, because of nuclear power, because of air filtration systems on every power station. They're carbon capturing now, and they're doing things with wind. And there's one city in Guangdong that is 100% powered by wind. One city, Zhenjiang, and it's only a couple of hundred kilometers from here, but it's entirely powered by wind and waves. There is no power station for that entire city. And that's the kind of thing that China is doing. So when you come here and see something is different, the first thing you'll say is, wow, that wasn't what I expected.
Well, I think you already heard some of the members ask me about organizing a tour to
Yeah.
China. So, if possible, I will pass through Zhongshan and try to visit you.
Well, honestly, I heard you say that you plan to land in Shenzhen. The airport is
Yeah.
only 1 hour across this new bridge. Now, if you want to see infrastructure, this is infrastructure. China has built a bridge across the Pearl River Delta. It's two bridges actually across the Pearl River Delta. One is from Hong Kong Airport all the way into Zhuhai, and the other is from Shenzhen, very close to the airport. It's not actually from the airport, but it's very close, and it comes across straight to the southern part of Zhongshan. So from is Boan Airport in Shenzhen, from there to my front door is about an hour and 10 minutes now. And it used
Wow.
to be a 3 hour drive, at least.
Yeah, you used to be had a route up or route down
Yeah.
through. And I also like to try to take the tour through the Hong Kong, Macau, Zhuhai bridge. That was
Yes.
another magnificent infrastructure.
Yeah.
So that I will try to see what we can do. Probably
Well,
we
just
will
make
land
sure
in
that
Shenzhen.
everybody who comes, if they're coming on a visa, they would have to have a double entry visa. But if they're Australian citizens coming across, then they can come and go as they please. So they can arrive in Shenzhen, go across to Hong Kong, and then come back on the visa-free visit. And there's an interesting thing: a 30-day visa-free visit. You can arrive in Shenzhen, travel the length and breadth of China. The only place you can't go without getting an extra permit is Tibet, Xinjiang. You can go to Xinjiang if you want to. It's a 5 hour flight to Urumqi from Guangdong. But once you've been around China for 28 days, hop across to Hong Kong or Macau, and then come back and start again. You have another 30 days.
Is that right?
Yes.
Wow, that is interesting.
Hmm.
Okay, now, Australia here just suffer from a very bad economic downturns. Our ABS show that from March 2022 to March 2024, our economy per capita dropped by about 8%.
Hmm.
And I myself here feel the prices going up since COVID. So again, very interesting comparison from the TikTok refugees. They compare the living standards in America and in China. So
Hmm.
you have been living in China. So can you tell us a little bit about the living standard there? How do
Sure.
you enjoy your life and what kind of expenses you are? Sorry
Okay.
about
Well,
that.
no, it's no problem. I've actually made a video about how I live my life. I'm a pensioner. I get a police pension and I get the British government pension, which is a proportionate. I actually only receive £70 a week from them, so £300 a month. I get 70 something pounds a week. And then I also had a superannuation in Australia, which I cashed in, and I make a little bit of money writing. I'm a freelance writer, amongst other things. So I wouldn't make much, probably make less than 10,000 RMB a year in income because I'm 66 years old. But I have about 10,000 RMB a month in pensions and money that's available to me. So 10,000 RMB a month is about $2,000. I live like a king. I own my own apartment. When you own an apartment in China, you don't pay any rates, you don't pay any maintenance fees unless you live in a gardens that has security, swimming pool, elevators, those kinds of things. If you have them, then you have to pay maintenance fees, of course. But in my case, I live in a small two-bedroom, in fact, sorry, three-bedroom. One room is our bedroom. One room is the one I'm in now, which is a studio. I've converted it, and the other room is my wife's. We call it her prayer room. She's a Buddhist, and she has a little prayer room. So we have a three-bedroom apartment. This apartment cost 500,000 RMB, and then we spent 120, 130,000 RMB. There are approximately 4.5 RMB to $1. So 500,000 RMB is approximately 100,000 uh, Australian dollars. That's what it cost me for a three-bedroom apartment. And I bought this apartment in January last year. So it's just 12 months, a little over 12 months since we bought this apartment. So that's the price of ordinary housing. I mean, you can pay a lot more. You can have up to 8 or 9 million RMB homes. But this is Zhongshan. In Shenzhen, in Shanghai, Beijing, it would be 4 or 5 times that price, at least. And so it depends a lot on where you are. Now, I went out the other day, I buy eggs by the tray, and this is probably the easiest way to describe it. I get 30 eggs. It costs me 22 RMB, which is in US terms about $3, in Australian terms about less than $6, $5 for 30 eggs. That's what it costs me. I drink bottled water, which costs 1 RMB per bottle. I have, if we go out for a beer, three of us, usually there's three guys who go out for a beer together, and we'll drink 3 or 4 bottles of beer, large bottles, and we spend about 60 RMB, which is $15. And that's not each, that's the total. So we're getting six or 9 bottles of beer for yeah, $5 a head. So that's pretty good. Going out to a restaurant last night, we had a restaurant meal with some friends who are here from Canada. There were 2 tables, and we had 11 people on each table, so 22 people. Our meal came to 1,300 RMB. Divide that by five approximately. It's a little better than that, but divide that by five and you've got the price of a meal for 22 people in a restaurant. And we took our own wine. There is no corkage charge. If you go to a restaurant here with a bottle of wine, no problems at all. There's no corkage charge. One of the dishes we took to this restaurant was my father's homemade fish balls, and they're really delicious. And he made the fish balls and they cooked them for us. And they did that for free because we were spending over 1,000 RMB for dinner. So that was okay. It is pretty cheap to live here. The best thing to think about is not how much money someone earns, it's price purchase parity. GDP is not a good method of understanding. Price purchase parity is. Anybody who's got 10,000 RMB a month here is doing very well in any city, anywhere in China. And most people are getting that kind of money. Now, if you just left school, you're working in a shop, or you're a waitress, you probably would earn 4 to 5, maybe 6,000 RMB a month. There's no tipping. So your salary is what you get, but there'll be very little taxation on that. We have about a 4,000 RMB a month tax-free threshold. So people who are at the lower income end don't pay tax. Pensioners, by the way, I noticed that there's quite an aged population in Australia. I believe it's much higher than it ought to be for a demographic society. But pensioners don't pay tax. Full stop. This is something that's amazing. Our boss, even me, I'm a foreigner. I'm not a permanent resident of China yet. I'm married resident of China, and I've been a resident for more than 10 years. I get free bus travel. I just have to show my passport, which says I'm over 60. Now, I don't carry my passport, so if I get on the bus, it only costs me 1 or 2 RMB. I don't worry about it. You can go on a bus anywhere in Zhongshan for the most expensive bus fare is 3 RMB, so that's 80 cents, or 80 Australian cents. That gives you an idea. You can live very comfortably here if you choose to. We have an apartment. The apartment that we moved out of to move into here, we didn't sell it because property prices are very low at the moment. And we've got somebody interested in renting it. It's a 2-bedroom apartment, 60 square meters. I'm not sure how that relates in Australian terms, how big that is, because I think you do things in squares in Australia. But it's 60 square meters, and the person who wants to rent it will pay 11 or 1,200 RMB a month. So even if they're working in a shop, it's 30%. If there's, I don't know what they're doing, but if their income is 4,500 or 5,000 RMB, then their rent is manageable. It's not that kind of rental anxiety that you get. And we have no intention of selling it, so there's no anxiety about whether or not they will keep their roof over their heads. So if they do rent it, they'll be paying us 1,200 maximum.
Okay, so maybe I open up. Anybody
Sure.
like to ask any questions? Please unmute yourself. Noel?
Can you go there as a tourist and buy a property?
No, you need to have a resident visa or you need to be Chinese. Now, in the case of myself, I bought my first property when I was working. I had what's called a working resident permit. So I was working for a corporation here. I was the training manager of a British company. And because I had that, I was able to buy an apartment. And in my case, we actually have bought 3 apartments since we got married. The first one is in my wife's name, the second one is in my name, and the third one is in my wife's name. And that's really just a convenience. We could have put it in joint names, but if something happens to me, my wife is much easier disposed. Now, if something happens to my wife, it doesn't really matter what properties I have. I probably would still stay in China and I'd just live here until something happened to me. But in the case of my wife, she owns 2 of the properties that we have and I own the other one. But you do need to have a resident permit, and you can get that if you work here. And even if you come on a 1-year working contract, you can buy a property. Once you've bought it, it's yours for 70 years. And at the end of 70 years, it stays in your family if your family still live there. You can sell it, but a lot of people say, but you'll never ever own a property in China. Well, I have a 70-year lease on this property, not the property, the land. The land will return to the government after 70 years. Or if I happen to be here or one of my children happens to be living here, they can renew the lease for a further 70 years. So it's not as simple as saying, you're going to lose it in 70 years. First of all, I'm 66 years of age and 70 years doesn't faze me at all. I won't be here. But my wife has family members who can move in here, and as long as they're my wife's family, this property will belong to them. All they need to do is change the registration of it.
Okay, any other questions?
Yes, I have a question. I'm about to go
Yes,
on a
please.
short I'm about to go on a short tour to China with my choir. Can you tell me the best way to pay for anything I might want to buy?
Okay, there are ways to pay. You use your mobile phone. Do you have WeChat or Alipay?
No, but I've been told
Okay,
about Alipay. How do you get it?
okay, you just download it. Go to your shop. What if you're Apple, go to the Apple store. If you're Android, go to the Android store and download Alipay. You can now access your international banks through both WeChat and Alipay. I actually have somewhere in here. It is. There's a booklet, and it's called The Guide to Payment Systems. You can pick this up in any bank. Any bank in China will be able to give you a copy of this. So if you have problems on day one, go to a bank and say, can I get this? And inside it's extremely clear. It just shows you graphically how to do it. The other thing is, a lot of people are afraid that they can't use cash anymore. Well, you can. You can use cash. The only issue is that when you go to your bank to get Chinese money, they will give you RMBs, usually in hundreds. 100 RMB is the largest denomination. Now, if you get a taxi in China and your taxi costs 7 RMB or 8 RMB, which is quite common, so it's $2 to get in a taxi and go across town, and you give the guy 100, he may say, I don't have the change. And that is a problem. So if you can get, sorry, I've lost Jenny there. I had Jenny for a moment, but if you can get small change, then you will be able to operate perfectly normally without any issues. If you don't have small change, you may be giving them a big tip if you're paying something. If it's 80 RMB, you could just say, well, keep the change. And they'll go, no, 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 and try not to. Very few people will rip you off in China. They will try and give you the change back. They'll go to another shop and find out what's going on. But if you can keep small denomination notes, then there won't be a problem.
Thank you.
No problem.
And when I was in Hong Kong trying to get the WeChat Pay, I went to a Chinese bank, the Bank of China,
Yep.
bracket Hong Kong. And then the guy do everything for me. I just hand the guy my Apple iPhone, and then he download everything, arrange everything. What I need is only a Hong Kong telephone number.
That's it. Yeah. You need to have a local telephone number to use it, to use WeChat locally. But if you've got an international telephone number, you can use your international bank, no problems at all. Now, I think you were probably accessing a Hong Kong bank through your WeChat, and that does need to have verification.
No, I want to.
Yeah. The account I have at the Hong Kong Bank of China is a Hong Kong nominated, not Hong Kong dollar nominated account, but at the same time, I also have a Class B China account in the Bank of China.
Okay.
Class B account means that every day my maximum transaction is 5,000 renminbi. That would be the limit of a Class B account. And my Hong Kong account and the Chinese account are linked. So if I draw money from my Hong Kong account, if I have money in the Chinese account, it will flow to Hong Kong account. If I don't have money in my Chinese account, I draw money from there, then the money from Hong Kong account will flow to there automatically. So they are always balanced out.
Right.
Very easy to use.
What about credit cards?
Credit cards, no problem at all. I use a MasterCard and Visa. When I travel outside of China, I load up my credit card. I was in Sri Lanka just 3 months ago. I loaded up my Chinese credit card and I just used it as the ATM card.
65,
very simple.
but he's a bit of a cyclist. Like he's cycled the length of China. Like he
Pam,
went to.
you've come in with something about me being a cyclist.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was off mute, so I'll just mute myself. Sorry, dear.
No problem.
Can you tell me something about the medical system in China for both the locals and any visitors?
I can. I actually suffered from a thrombosis attack just a few months ago. I ended up 5 days in the local hospital. It cost me a total of 7,000 RMB. That included 5 days stay in the hospital. It included all my medicines, all the doctor's fees, everything, and 1 month of blood thinning tablets to be going on with it when I left the hospital. So for me, it was a perfectly reasonable experience. There was no issues. It's not something you want to go through, but the hospital system, it appears to the new eye who has never seen the Chinese hospital, it appears quite chaotic. But when you know your way around the system, it's actually quite easy. And there are private hospitals here that are cheaper than the US and Australia and the UK. And people do come here as medical tourists. I wouldn't recommend that if you're on the national health, if you're on Medicare, if you've got private insurance, why would you go to China to do it? But for someone who doesn't have any of those coverages, it's not very expensive. In my own case, because of my age in China, I'm not able to get insurance, medical insurance, except a very expensive overseas system. So I'd have to go to an Australian or American corporation, buy an insurance, and then claim. Now, what I've done is I've basically self-insured. I have 250,000 RMB put aside into a bank account for if I ever need that. And that's going to be enough for pretty much everything that could happen to me. So that's the way I live my life. A friend of mine, a British guy who lives in Shenzhen, he got cancer. He got breast cancer, and it was very serious. He had to undergo chemotherapy that didn't work. He had radiation, it didn't work. He had a 5-hour operation, and that did work. And then he followed that up with chemo and radiation and some other treatments. And this is 2-3 years ago. The entire thing cost him less than 20,000 pounds. It was 120,000 RMB. So really, if you're coming here to live, then you need to set aside, I would say, a couple of 100,000 RMB. If you're coming here on a traveling, touring holiday, get yourself some insurance. But it's not that expensive to get insurance for a 30-day tour. It's much more expensive to get insurance when you live here and you are an overseas expat. So the self-insurance is my answer. I've put aside 250,000 RMB. It sits in the bank. It hasn't been touched for a couple of years. And I got that from my Australian superannuation a couple of years ago. Just put it in the bank and leave it there.
Actually, if we are considering our group is from UVA, University of Third Age, are all retired people organizing according to a university style courses. So this is the China Today course, but we are all retired. So a lot of people will be thinking of, can we retire in China? Have you got any information of foreigners, for example, from Australia, trying to retire in China?
Unfortunately, the simple answer is no. That's the simple answer. Now, there are always ways around this. Now, if you have a connection to China, so in my case, I'm married and I live here on a spousal visa. And because I've been doing that for many years, I'm in the process now of applying for permanent residency. And that will almost certainly, I'd be 99 point something percent certain that will be granted to me because I've met all the criteria. I've raised a lot of money for charity. I've done a lot of positive things for China. I'm a perfect candidate for permanent residency, and I will get it, I'm certain. However, I needed to have a connection. Now, if I had decided, if I wasn't married, for example, and I worked here, and I decided before I retired to apply for permanent residency, I could do so. You need to be a resident for 5 years, a legal resident. And I was a legal resident for many years as a working permit resident or working permit holder. So I was legally resident inside of China, and I could apply anytime after being a resident for 5 years. You can apply for permanent residency, and then you can retire here. But unless you have one of those two connections, you're either worked here for 5 years or you're married here, then you can't really retire here. Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, they have what's called retirement visas. You lodge, I think, 30,000 US dollars into a bank account for 6 months, apply for a visa, and then at the end of 6 months, you get the money back that you lodged, and you can live your life in one of those countries, but not in China. I think the way China views this is it will never happen here. There are already too many older Chinese. The demographics is the same as Japan, the same as Australia, the same as America, although it gets reported as being so much worse. Because the numbers are high, the percentage is actually lower than Japan, lower than the United States, but it's still an aging population. So they're not going to take us oldies unless we have a connection to China. So the simple answer is no, you cannot retire in China unless you have a connection to the place.
But I can.
You can.
I'm
Yes.
born.
Hong Kong
Yeah,
residents can.
Yeah, I was born in Hong Kong, and therefore I'm brought up both in Hong Kong, and therefore I can always retire in China. There's actually
Yep.
Now let's switch to another issue. How about personal security in China? You were police. So from that point of view, how do you compare the Chinese situation with, say, Australia or Britain?
There is no comparison, Albert. I'm afraid there is no comparison. China is the safest, most stable place that I've ever been to in my entire life. I can quite happily walk around the streets at 2 o'clock in the morning, 1 o'clock in the morning. It doesn't matter. There are no homeless people. There is no drug issues. There is no street crime, virtually no street crime at all. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. When it does, it makes in fact, when street crime happens here, it makes international news. When you hear of someone being beaten up in the street, it's all over the Daily Telegraph. Why? Because it is so rare. It's very, very rare. Someone got stabbed here, and there were 2 incidents in 3 weeks, 21 days. There were 2 stabbing incidents, and the British media was all over this. But the British media forgets to tell us that they have, in the United Kingdom, 5,000 stabbing incidents a day. A day. I'm not kidding. 5,000 stabbing incidents a day. China had 2, and it's all over international news. Yeah, it does happen, but it's extremely rare. And I would be 100% confident if my wife is walking home at 2 o'clock in the morning from a bar, having had a couple of drinks, if she wanted to, she would be safe. That's how confident I am. Now, my wife doesn't go out to bars until 2 o'clock in the morning, but if she chose to, I would be confident that she would come home safely. And I'd be confident that I could get home safely. There are no issues. The fact that I cycled across China tells you something. A lot of people said, isn't that dangerous? Especially going into Xinjiang. It must be dangerous. Well, I went into Xinjiang and it wasn't dangerous. It's not at all dangerous. In fact, if anything, Xinjiang is the safest place because there's an even bigger police presence there. Now, there are a lot of police. There are a lot of cameras, but that's surveillance. And do you remember what I said earlier on? It comes down to trust in law enforcement. People in China see all of this and see it as making the place safer. Since the cameras were put in and since the police are all over the place, there is very little need for crime. Poverty has been alleviated. There is no absolute poverty. No one wakes up in the morning and says, I think I'll become a criminal. They wake up in the morning hungry and say, how am I going to get food? I'm going to have to steal it. And that's how crime happens. Now, that doesn't happen in China. There is no poverty. And that's a fact as well. There are a lot of poor people, but there's no absolute poverty. Poor people can still afford to eat, and the government does care for them. So crime, virtually non-existent. The murder rate in China, according to Statista, is 0. And I'm not kidding you. The murder rate in the United States, in some cities, is 65 people per 100,000. The murder rate overall in the United States is 6.5 per 100,000 people. That's overall for the United States. But New Orleans is 65. China's murder rate is so low per 100,000 people that it doesn't even measure up to 0.5. They can't even, in the scale of things, it's too low. So there's virtually no murder, virtually no rape, no crime, no mugging, no robbery, no theft, no burglaries. It doesn't happen. I do not know a single person in China who has been robbed, raped, murdered, or had their house burgled in the last 10 years. I don't know any. That's how safe China is.
Can I ask another question?
Sure, Jenny.
Jerry, would you care to make a comment about what we read of so-called Chinese expansion into poor countries in Africa, Pacific Islands, South China Sea, airspace being invaded by drones, etc.?
Yeah,
is it all
Chinese
lies?
It's not all lies, Jenny. As I said before, there's 2% of truth in everything, and the rest is misunderstanding. Some of it is paid for misunderstanding. Some of it is genuine misunderstanding. Geeta Ramchand just said, can you see my question? I saw a question earlier on, but I'm letting Albert manage the questions. So, Geeta, yes, we'll come back to you. In China, they are socialist. What that means is they plan to help the people who work, the workers, the peasants, the farmers, the factory workers. This is the hammer and sickle symbol. They are genuine socialists. Now, they are socialists with capitalist leanings, and that's what's called socialism with Chinese characteristics. So that is what's happening in China. The people get more say in how they run the country. It is a dictatorship of the proletariat. That means the people tell the government how they want to be managed. And that's what the National People's Congress does. Now, that's inside of China. Now, you're asking about China's expansion. There are some disputes over South China Sea issues. They're nothing to do with America, and they're certainly nothing to do with Australia. You're 10,000 kilometers away. America is 15,000 kilometers away. What's the dispute about? The Philippines says we want this island, and China says, no, you can't have it. It's ours. That's the dispute. Now, that's a neighborly dispute between countries, and it happens all the time. I'm sure there's disputes between Australia and Papua New Guinea from time to time because they've got islands in the middle, and who owns those islands, and the UK just took them years ago. What we got going on in Africa in particular is not what the West reports as any form of debt bondage. There are 54 countries in Africa. 53 of the leaders of those 54 countries were in China a few months ago, back in September, October, at a Pan-African summit that China held. Why does China do this? It's trying to help the people. It's trying to lift poverty. And this is already happening. Now, China builds hospitals, it builds ports, it builds roads, it builds train stations. What does the UK, or what did the UK do for 400 years to Africa? They exploited every resource that they could exploit. They enslaved the Africans and took them to the other side of the world. And that is why America has problems today with its racial demographics, because they exploited people and they put them into slavery and bondage, and then they made them work. They've done the same in Africa. They have blood diamonds there. They have all kinds of lithium. Elon Musk said, we'll coup who we want to coup, deal with it. He doesn't care about the people when he wants his lithium for his batteries. China says, we want your lithium. We will build a road. We'll build a hospital. We'll build a port. We'll build a train line. And we will leave them there. They're yours. There's the difference. So China is actually enriching and enabling African countries, while for the last 400 years, Spain, Britain, America more recently, and Holland have exploited those countries, and they have enslaved and impoverished. Africa is the poorest continent on earth. Why is it the poorest continent when it's the richest in resources? And that's what China is doing. It's going there completely different to what the West are reporting and saying, we would like to have your lithium. We'll buy it at market prices, but in order to buy it, we need to train your people in how to get it, how to extract it, how to process it. So we'll build a university for you here. We'll build a CDC for you here. We'll build a parliament house for you here. We'll build a port so we can bring our ships in and take stuff out. That's what China is doing. It is not debt bondage. That's been completely, entirely debunked. There is a professor in the United States called Deborah Brautigam, Brautigm, I think, Brautigam or Broughton. Now, she has written a book about this, not specifically on Africa, but about this kind of debt trap diplomacy. And she's debunked it entirely, completely, entirely debunked. Harvard Business Review have published reports. This is not true. So what we don't see is what China is doing beneficially. And what we do see is American, particularly American, exploitative media telling us that China are doing what we have traditionally always done. They're stealing our exploited resources. Well, China's not. China is helping them. 53 of 54 countries believe that's true. And you can read about that on Chinese media rather than in Western media. I follow the State Council Information Office for what's going on in China. And they're often, I cannot prove China has ever lied. In its media, in its government releases, they simply do not lie. What they will do is omit to tell us all the truth. But I've never found Chinese media or a Chinese government release to tell a lie, ever. But I can find them in American media, British media, and Australian media all the time.
Okay, now we have a question in our chat. What is their view on observing international patent laws?
Right. Very different to the American view on international patent laws. America will steal your patents. That's been proven time and time again. China will not. China actually has extremely strong patent protection laws. Now, we will read quite often about how China steals technology. The truth is, China does not steal your technology. It started in 1978, 1979, when Deng Xiaoping opened and reformed. What Deng Xiaoping said is, we have a huge market. You want to capitalize on that market. You can bring your factories here. We're not importing because we can't afford to import. We're a poor country. So we're not going to import from you. We want you to bring your factories here and manufacture so we can export from here. But at the same time, you want our market. So we want shared technology. Now, what organizations then did? VW were the biggest one, Mercedes-Benz and a few others. They came across here with 2-year-old technology, and they shared it with China. China then took that technology on an agreed shared basis. It was technology transfer, and it was shared in agreement because VW wanted to sell their cars in China. And for a long time, every taxi in China was a VW. They got a massive market input. All the rich people in China bought Mercedes-Benz that were made here in China. So this is what Mercedes and VW did, and many other companies. They came across here with 2-year-old technology, and they sold everything into the market, and they exported to other markets, less well-developed markets. But if you wanted the top of the range, newest technology, it was never transferred to China. It was built in where Dusseldorf or wherever it is that they build Mercedes-Benz, and it was built using the top-of-the-range technology. Now, I have a friend here who waited 2 years to get a car because he wanted the top-of-the-range car, and he couldn't buy it in China. He had to have it imported from Germany because he wanted the top-of-the-range technology. Now, they didn't transfer that. And here's another thing. Why doesn't China have Coca-Cola's secret recipe or Colonel Sanders' secret recipe? Because they don't force you to transfer this technology. They say if you want the marketplace, then you share the technology. But we're not stealing it. They have never stolen anything. Coca-Cola operates, KFC operates here in China. They're massive. Both of them are very big, very, very big, and none of their secrets have been taken by China. Probably because China has better fried chicken anyway, but that's a different story.
And the KFC in China is different from KFC here as well.
It is, but fried chicken is fried chicken wherever you go. But KFC's secret recipe is quite safe. China doesn't want to steal it. The IP protection laws in China are extremely, extremely strong. Now, what's really most interesting when you hear about these huge IP problems, they're usually Apple and Samsung. Huawei is never involved in these things. This is the big one. In communications or telecommunications, Apple and Samsung are constantly fighting in the courts. Both of them manufacture in China, and neither of them are suing Chinese corporations for IP theft. Huawei is doing its own thing. China is innovating, it's improving. Now, when the Apple first came out, I remember this 15 years ago or so, the iPhone first came out. I think it was the iPhone 4 was the first one. And I'm not sure what happened to 1, 2, or 3, but iPhone 4 was the first one I ever saw. The day they came out, people in China were opening them up and looking at them. And instead of stealing the technology, they were saying, we can do better than this. And that's how Xiaomi came about. That's how Huawei came about. That's how these organizations, Vivo, Oppo, these are all great Chinese brands, and they're all better and cheaper than most American brands. Motorola, Nokia, they don't exist anymore. Apple has done what it does. And Apple is the most exploitative corporation in history, in my opinion. They'll exploit their workers, they'll exploit their staff, they'll exploit their customers. And they are the only people who benefit from Apple are not the users at all, but the people who have dividends and shares. The CEO gets a very, very big bonus from exploiting workers and exploiting consumers, selling something at the highest profit margin possible.
You talk about taxi. The last 2 years ago when I was in Chengdu, all the taxis are BYD. Is that true in Zhongshan?
Yeah, not all BYD. I would say they're now about 98% electric EVs, but they're not all BYD. A lot of them are, yes, because BYD make damn good cars, and they are very, very good at what they do. I would guess that in major cities, certainly in this city, 100% of the buses and definitely more than half of the taxis are all electric. Now, in this city, it's much higher. It's 70, 80, 90%. I don't know. In Shenzhen, it's 100%. There are no petrol-driven taxis in Shenzhen anymore. Because BYD are there, that's their hometown, and they have literally taken that market, completely taken that market. They're now outselling Teslas around the world as well. They are the biggest car company, let alone the biggest EV. They're the biggest EV by a long way, but they're the biggest car company now. They've overtaken Toyota, I believe, which was the biggest car company.
They overtaken Toyota.
I believe so, yeah. If not,
okay,
they will.
Here's another question. It is reported to us that it's Chinese workers who build overseas structures, not the native people. Do you know the true stats?
Chinese engineers go there. I've got a friend living in Zambia, and he tells me that there's a fairly high percentage of Chinese people there, but they're mostly the CEOs, the senior managers, the engineers, the qualified people. But no, currently, which country is Cambodia? No, Colombia. Colombia, sorry. Colombia is getting a subway system built by China. Now, the engineers are all Chinese, of course, because they're using Chinese technology, they're using Chinese know-how, Chinese engineering, but all of the workers are Colombians. And 200 of those Colombians are currently in China studying how to operate a metro system. So they will go back to Colombia, those 200 people, and they will become the trainers of Colombian people. So no, there is no question. There aren't enough Chinese workers in China to do what China needs, let alone exporting workers. They do export engineers. Lots of engineers go to live in Africa for several years. My own neighbor actually recently returned from Puerto Rico, spent 5 years in Puerto Rico, but working with Puerto Ricans to build infrastructure. So that's what they do. They go there with the engineering know-how, they go with the technical know-how, and they do have a high percentage of Chinese people in any city or country that is part of the Belt and Road Initiative will have a high percentage, but the workers are all local, and they will all be getting whatever the local laws say they should be getting. So there's no exploitation going on. There is cross-training. There's a lot of videos about this on YouTube. There's cross-training going on. A lot of people go from here to another country, spend 1 year there, train people, and then those people can then train the next generation of employees, depending on whether they're skilled or unskilled. If they're unskilled, they'll all be locals. Why would you send unskilled workers from here to there? It'd be crazy. If you're going to Africa, you're not going to pay them, because Chinese salaries are quite high. You're not going to pay unskilled workers from China to fly across there, get visas, all the expenses of keeping them there with medicals, and you can employ locals. It's much cheaper. Why would you do that?
We just have the Chinese New Year. So you married a Chinese lady.
Yes.
So how do you feel in this Chinese traditional festival as a foreigner? Or part China, part foreigner?
Yeah, I would say I've become more culturally Chinese than perhaps many of my friends. I studied 10 years ago, while I was in China, I studied a master's degree in the UK, but I was based in China doing it online, and I studied cross-cultural change management, which I found fascinating because it opened so many doors for me in culture. I now consider myself very much an apprentice in Chinese culture. My wife is constantly correcting me, and she's the best teacher possible. But I do see myself more Chinese than Western now, mentally. If I'm certainly not in my appearance, I'm as Western as they come. But mentally, I assimilated quite well into China, and I understand. Not always. I mean, there's a lot of things that Chinese people do. Behavioral psychology is a very, very wide field, and I've only just scraped the surface of it. But I often see, I get my foreign friends saying, why did they do that? And there's always a really interesting response. I can always find out why they did that. What is the truth about Uyghurs re-education camps? Gita, we covered that. I'll go a little bit more depth. Gita, what the re-education camps, these are vocational training colleges. China opened them in Xinjiang and has closed them since. What they did was nobody was forced, although some people were told you have to do this. They were people who had been to prison, and as part of their rehabilitation, they were trained and skilled up to do something. There is no concentration camps. End of story. There is no genocide. There is no cultural genocide. There is no forced labor. What there is in China is a rule of law, and if you break the law, you go to prison. If you go to prison, you are rehabilitated rather than punished in China. And part of that rehabilitation may very well be, we'll give you a skill. You're going to learn to speak Mandarin if you don't already speak Mandarin, because that's the language of the country. And with that language, you can go anywhere. So you need to pass a Mandarin course. You need to learn a skill. What would you like to do? Would you like to be a CNC operator? Would you like to be a hairdresser? Would you like to work in a factory sewing with sewing machines? You will be given a skill as part of your rehabilitation. And that's what these were. Now, farmers, China has industrialized farming. There are virtually no hand farming left anymore. The subsistence farming is gone, and it's done by machines. Now, who operates those machines? Farmers. How do the farmers learn to operate those machines? By going to re-education centers to learn how to use the machinery to make their life better and easier in the future. What that does then, because the government provides the machinery will go into a collective. So you use the same machinery on this farm as that farm, and all of the collective gets better crop yields, better income, better lifestyle, because they're no longer back-breaking work. It's still hard work being a farmer. Even with industrialization, it's hard work. Believe me, I know this because I've been on many farms and seen how hard they work. But they're working a lot less hard, and they're getting better rewards as a result of re-education. Now, what you should do is go to the State Council Information Office in English and look at what has happened. The white paper on Xinjiang issued by the State Council Information Office, and that will tell you what's happened in that region. The GDP of that region, the life expectancy of that region, the population of that region, the income per family of that region have all increased phenomenally because of what China has done. Now, it's the worst genocide in the world when you double the population. That's what has happened in Xinjiang over the last 15 years. The population has doubled. Now, how does that happen when people are forced? There is no forced labor. There is no persecution. There is no Islamic suppression. There is complete religious freedom, but there is no extremism either. There is no terrorism, and there is no crime. So that's what's happened inside of Xinjiang.
So Gita follow-ups saying that there is no problem with any religious practice, going by your wife practicing Buddhism.
Well, Buddhism is not a religion, it's a philosophy, and it's a very popular one. Taoism is another one, Confucianism. These are basically Chinese culture rather than religions. They're Chinese ways of living. I'm a Christian, but I'm pretty lapsed. But I have Christian friends. Mario Cavolo, who lives in Shenyang, is a Christian friend of mine. Shenyang, I can see up near Manchuria there. It's in Manchuria, behind your head, Albert. Shenyang is a small city. It's an industrial city. And my friend is a Catholic. His wife has converted. His son has had his first communion, his confirmation, all of those things. And so he's a Catholic living there. I had a friend of mine, a guy called James Hsu, and James is online. He's quite active online. He's also a Hong Kong resident who lives in Canada, and he's been backwards and forwards to China. And on the first day he arrived here, I picked him up at the ferry port. It was a Sunday, and I said, "Do you want to go to church?" He said, "Yes, I do." And I took him to the first church. He said, "No, this one's Catholic. It's not for me." So I took him to the second church, and he gave me the thumbs up and went in. And I went and had a cup of coffee and waited for him to finish. As far as he was concerned, it was a service was in Cantonese because we're in Guangdong. And he said it was a perfectly ordinary, normal service. There is no religious oppression here. I've made videos about religious oppression. There are some things that are banned in religion. Now, this is where the West has the 2% of truth and then misinterprets to give us an image that it's a problem. Falun Gong, for example, is banned. Falun Gong is not a religion, it is a cult. Now, even the ABC in Australia, which hates China, has exposed Falun Gong as a cult. It's a cult where children are exploited, Shenyang, I think, or Shenzhen, they have a dance troupe that go around talking about China before communism, and these kids are exploited kids. There is a law within this church that they call it, whereby people are not allowed to seek the help of doctors if they're sick. They can't go to the doctor. That's illegal in China. If you're sick and someone says don't go to the doctor, that person breaks the law. So that's one of the problems. There's another law in China that says churches cannot get rich. The leaders of churches can't enrich themselves. And yet the leader of Falun Gong lives in a mansion on acres of land in New York and has enriched himself. He has Rolls-Royce cars. He has a private jet. He has all of the trappings of capitalism. And that is not religion. And that's what China bans. You are perfectly free to have your religion as long as your religion is one of the religions. Even the Pope has accepted China's religious freedom. Now, you can tell the Pope he's wrong, but you're basically telling God he's wrong when you do that. So in matters of theology, the Pope is infallible. Now, if the Pope says, I have no problem with China's freedom of religion, then where's the problem? So in terms of Catholicism, Islam, the oldest mosque in China is in Guangdong. I've traveled through Gansu, which is predominantly Islamic region. Ningxia is a Hui autonomous region, and the Hui people are fundamentally Islamic. Xinjiang is very much a Muslim area, but not all Uyghurs are Muslims, and not all Muslims are Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So masses of people who are doing different things. Christianity is okay. I've been to churches. I don't go to church anymore myself, but I've been into churches. Midnight Mass here was huge. I was there 2 or 3 years ago. Actually, it was more than that. It was probably closer to 10 years ago. The year my mother passed away, I went to Midnight Mass out of respect for my mother, because I know she would have liked that. And I couldn't get in. I was standing outside on the porch of the church. A few years ago, they knocked our church down. I was horrified. Oh no, I've been misled. I'm wrong. They've knocked the church down. And then they rebuilt another one, which is even bigger and better and more beautiful. And they don't have pictures of Xi Jinping inside of the church. That's a myth. I don't know where that came from. I think that came from Epoch Times, which is the Falun Gong's media outlet. So Falun Gong is definitely a cult, and it is definitely banned in China.
I have a question.
Yes.
What's the current position? Sorry, my apologies. What's the current position with the mainland China's involvement with Tibet? I mean, we've been told that they forcibly took Tibet over, and we're told that the Tibetans live under an oppressive regime from China. So what's the real position here from your point of view?
I was in Tibet in September last year. My first trip to Tibet. You do need a special permit to go there. And the reason for that is not at all related to security. It's related to health. They're very worried about people, particularly foreigners, going there and succumbing to some kind of altitude sickness. So you go there in a group. That's the reason behind it. Now, having said that, anyone can go to Tibet. China did not invade Tibet. Tibet, historically and geographically, is part of China. The Dalai Lama invited the People's Liberation Army into Tibet. Now, this is a matter of historical record. And here's a very interesting thing which no one will tell you. When the People's Liberation Army, and they call it the peaceful liberation of Tibet, when they went into Tibet, they did have some problems. Now, I don't know if you know what the McMahon line is. This is a line that the British government drew in 1917 across part of Tibet and gave it to India. Now, that has caused conflict to this day. The People's Liberation Army of China says this is our land, and the Indians say, no, the British gave it to us. It's ours. The McMahon line, you can Google that and look it up. It's causing conflict today. It's M-C-M-A-H-O-N, McMahon. The McMahon line, I think it was 1917. Now, after the People's Liberation Army liberated Tibet at the invitation of the Dalai Lama, guess what the Dalai Lama did? He came to Beijing and he sat in the National People's Congress, and he was elected to the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. He was a member of China's government. Now, why would a man who says, you invaded me, come to Beijing as part of China's government? He's also receiving millions and millions of dollars of US funds to leave China. He left China. He left Tibet, which is part of China. There is no, inside of China, there is no discussion, debate, or argument. Mainland China and Tibet are the same thing. There is no discussion about it. Taiwan is the same, but that's another story. There's no discussion inside of China. Why would you even think that mainland China invaded Tibet? That's how Chinese people would view your question. Why would you even think that? The fact is that mainland China includes Tibet. It includes Xinjiang. It always has in modern history, certainly since before the United States and Australia existed as countries. Now, we could argue that, historically it was an independent country. Well, you could certainly argue that historically Australia was too. So are we going to give Australia back to the native Australians? No, we're not. So are we going to give Tibet back to the native Tibetans from 3,000, 2,000 years ago before we had recognized borders? But since we've had recognized borders, since we've had a League of Nations, since we've had the United Nations, Tibet has never been an independent country. Neither has Taiwan, neither has Hong Kong. These are not independent countries. They are an integral part of China's sovereign territory. And that's the view inside of China. I hold the view as well. I agree with it. There is no oppression whatsoever, or no visible oppression. Now, I was there on a group tour. You cannot hide what's going on outside the windows. You can't stop me going and for a walk in my free time, which is what I did. You can't stop me sitting in a restaurant and having a chat with the local people there. I had to speak Mandarin, and my Mandarin is functional but not fluent, so maybe some misunderstandings. But, if you travel through China and you're on your own and people are unwelcoming, they close the doors when you come near, then you can sense that there's some oppression there. When they open the doors and invite you into their house, and they invite you to partake of their drinks and meet their family, you know that this is not an oppressed society. And that's the China I know. I've never encountered any oppression inside of China, anywhere, anytime, including Tibet or Xinjiang. And I've been to Xinjiang 5 times, I think, and twice on a bike. I've cycled more than 5,000 kilometers through Xinjiang. So, no, the answer is no, there is no oppression there. Tibet was peacefully liberated from people who wanted to take it from China back in 1951, I think it was.
Yes, please.
Okay.
There's a second Noel with a question, Jerry.
Yeah, another Noel. Yeah.
Yeah. I spend a lot of my time arguing that China is not a country that wants to take over other countries. But can you explain to us a little bit about the Philippines? What is the situation with the islands there, and does China believe they belong to them or whatever?
Yeah, China does. When the Republic of China was formed before the war, there was no issues about this. They were just, and Philippines was an American colony at the time. When the Civil War happened and the People's Republic of China took over the responsibilities of being China's government, the Republic of China moved to Taiwan. And while they were there for the first few years, before there was a resolution that recognized Beijing, Taipei was the capital of China. During that period of time, Taipei issued an 11-dash line, which included what we now call the disputed islands. And that was globally accepted. Philippines wasn't really even technically a country at that time. It was still a colony of the United States, albeit a liberated colony after the Second World War where Japan had colonized it. So the Philippines had its own problems going on back then. At the time of the Cairo Declaration, at the time of the Shanghai Declaration or the Shanghai Agreement, all of this time, those islands have been recognized as within the 11-dash line that Taiwan presented to the United Nations as Chinese territory. There is now one country particularly one country that will like to cause conflict. Now, there's one particular island. It's not even an island, it's a shoal, and it has a ship which was deliberately beached on it. China has said time and time and time again, we don't want that. We recognize that it's ours, but we don't want it. We want it left pristine, and you've got to take that ship off. But the Philippines are now, under Bongbong Marcos, the Philippines are now replenishing that ship. They have troops living in that ship, and they want to build a permanent base on this shoal. It's not an island, it's just a shoal. They want to build a permanent base there. And that is what China is preventing. It's not saying you can't go on this island, because they're allowing food and they're allowing water and they're allowing medical supplies, but they will not allow building supplies. And that's where we're seeing the water jets and all the rest. This is purely and simply Americanism coming in and saying, how can we stir up trouble here? And that is what they're doing. It didn't happen when Duterte was the president of China, of the Philippines. Interesting, Duterte had agreed that this would be left alone. And then Bongbong Marcos comes along and suddenly there's a problem. Now, where's his money? His money is all controlled by the Americans. His parents were exiled out of the Philippines to Guam and then Hawaii on an American plane because they knew that in the future they will use this. They are holding Bongbong Marcos's massive funds, all illegal funds, and now they have control of the president's office of the Philippines. That's what the Americans wanted. They now have more bases in the Philippines. Why do Americans need bases in the Philippines? China's got no ambitions. There's no territorial ambitions from China, none whatsoever. So why is that happening? It's happening because America wants to poke China in the eye.
Want your retirement tour, Cap?
Sorry? Pam?
You don't want your new one?
I missed what Pam said there. Sorry.
Thank you, Jerry.
Okay. Does that answer your question? No. I mean, there literally is no expansion from China. In fact, the 11- line is now a 9- line because they gave some islands back to Vietnam. So China doesn't have expansion. Oh, by the way, these military installations that the Western media say they've militarized several islands. They haven't. They put airstrips on 2 islands. Not one military plane has landed on either of those 2 islands. Historically, I think it was about 8 or 10 years ago, one military plane landed to evacuate 2 injured workers. It landed, evacuated workers, and then took off. These are not military islands. They could be used militarily, but these are listening posts. They're advanced defensive posts for sure. They are weather stations. They're not militarized installations. There is no military on them, not yet. They may have listening posts there because America has got stealth submarines going in and out of Chinese waters. We know that for a fact. They crashed inside of Chinese waters. So we know that they're there. So the Chinese government is defending itself. What's wrong with that? You know, given history of what the Americans have done, I think the Chinese are right to defend themselves. And they have a defensive military. They have a defensive navy and they have a defensive air force. They have no military bases overseas. None in the South China Sea, none in Africa except Djibouti, where they work with the United Nations and the United States on piracy in the region. Piracy that we've just learned the United States is paying for through US aid. Gosh, I mean, it's just unraveling for them over there. Anyway, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah,
now,
you.
Pam, I'm not sure what you said.
Okay, we have Anne's got a question about a tennis player, Peng Shuai. Have you followed Peng Shuai? I haven't.
Yeah. Peng Shuai, she disappeared. She had an adulterous relationship with a government official. And I think you probably understand this. Anyone who understands China understands that we're kind of a traditional nature. Okay, thanks, Pam. Anybody who understands China understands that Chinese people are conservative, they're traditional. I mean, of course, there is openness in some societies, there's prostitution and pornography, but it's all illegal. And China is traditionally quite a conservative place. And somebody who got caught in a adulterous relationship with a senior government officer, and apparently, and the story goes, it was his wife who arranged it. So his wife was part of this. Now, all of them got off social media. Now, what would you do if, if suddenly you're a popular star, a local, I mean, she was one of the best tennis players in China, and suddenly she's all over social media as being an adulteress. What would you do? You would just get off social media, and that's what she did. She just took a private moment and got out, and that's what's happened. There's nothing untoward about her. She was interviewed in another country somewhere where she was at one of the open tennis competitions. And, you get people like young Drew Pavlu in Australia there who's always, where is Peng Shuai? The truth is, he's just an idiot. He's just capitalizing on something that the Western media, nobody in China disappears. If you are arrested, you haven't disappeared. If you're not arrested, you don't disappear. Can you clarify the story of a couple of Australian Chinese? There was one lady who was Australian Chinese. She worked for SBS, I think, and she'd been a former CGTN, and she admitted her guilt and was convicted. She was sentenced. On the day she was sentenced, she was released because she'd spent 2 years and 3 months in prison. And Penny Wong and the Albanese claimed a victory there, which may very well be true, but certainly that was China being, okay, the offense was quite minor, but it was an admitted offense. It wasn't spying. She had some documentation that was given to media on a confidentiality basis, and she released it, and she served her time for that, a punishment for what she did. Now, that's neither here nor there. She's an Australian person who was convicted of an offense in China. She's actually Chinese born. She speaks Chinese fluently. She grew up in China. It's not like this was some kind of strange, I'm being put in prison in a foreign country. China is her home country. She just hasn't, like me, I'm British, but I have an Australian passport. So if I'm put into a prison in China, it will be disorientating. For anyone going into prison is disorientating. They make a big story out of nothing. She committed a crime, and she was convicted of the crime, and she was sentenced, and then she was released. End of that story. The other one is a former Ministry of State security official. Now, this is a guy who is a spy, but he was a spy for China. He got himself out of China, and I don't know how. I don't know the story of how he ended up in Australia, whether he went via another country, whether he legitimately left and migrated, but he got Australian citizenship, and he wrote a book about his time as a spy working for the Ministry of State Security in China. Now, okay, this is James Bond stuff. He wrote a book about his time as a spy, and then he can't be a very bright guy because he brought his family back for a holiday to China, having just written a book about how China's spy system works because he was an insider in it, and he was subject to confidentiality agreements and probably whatever the Chinese equivalent of the Official Secrets Act, all of these things he was subject to. He wrote a book about what he'd done in the Secret Service of China and then came back to China on a holiday. What a fool. Why wouldn't you just stay in Australia? Maybe he wanted to make a point, but why would he come back after doing that? I personally will not visit Australia now because I speak positively about China, and I am subject to the what they call the Foreign Influence Registration Act. So I'm subject to, I'm an unregistered agent of foreign influence. So I'm not coming back to Australia until this situation is much better and the government say, we were wrong about China. We should have been worried about America, but we've been worried about China. Until that time happens, I'm not coming back to Australia. I don't feel safe. I think I would be locked up if I come back and charged with foreign influence, even though I'm not a foreign influencer. I'm just a person who lives here and tells what he sees. So yeah, those two stories. I don't know if there's any others. If there's anyone knows of another, then please let me know. But the two that I do know of, both of them have reasonable cause. You are not going to be subject to arbitrary arrest. There are tens of thousands of foreigners arriving in China every day, and none of them get arrested. The two Michaels from Canada have now admitted that they were spies. One of them was convicted. The other one was not. He was released on this Meng Wanzhou deal. But they were both spies. And one of them was a spy in North Korea. North Korea is an American-sanctioned country, and so therefore he should be charged in America for dealing with North Korea. This is a guy who was going backwards and forwards to North Korea. How is he getting away with this? Because it doesn't suit the narrative to charge him for being a spy in North Korea. That's the difference.
Okay, so I think that would be the last questions. Why are the Australians always told that we are in the wrong territory? For example, recent flares released in front of an Australian Air Force planes.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting one. I actually researched this, international flight rules. There are laws governing where you can fly and where you can't fly. Now, if you are a military plane and you are approaching a designated area, so China's airspace is a designated area, the Chinese military will scramble and they will escort you away. Now, you are given warnings, and this did happen. This plane, this Australian plane, which is 10,000 kilometers away from Australia, by the way, was approaching Chinese airspace. Now, we're not talking about disputed Chinese airspace. This plane was approaching Chinese airspace. The pilots of the escort planes, who were scrambled from somewhere in China, and I don't know where, but probably Hainan Island, but they were scrambled, and they went up to within range of that plane, and they gave that plane a warning. You are entering Chinese airspace. Please adjust your course away from China's airspace. If you do not, we will take action. That was done. That was followed through. When the plane did not adjust its course, the next escalation is to fly in front of the path of the plane and release flares. This is written in the international rules. The international law of the skies has this rule. The country defending itself has a right to release flares in front of the plane. Now, if the plane still doesn't turn, they can shoot it down. That's the escalation process. So they released the flares after the warning, and the next thing, they would have shot it down if it had continued into Chinese airspace. It was coming in a straight line direct for Chinese airspace, and they knew that. This is not a mistake. These guys know what they're doing. They have GPS on board. They know where they are. They got the warning, and then they got the first escalation, which is releasing flares. You can argue all you like. The flares were not released 30 meters away from the plane. The plane flew to within 30 meters of the flares. That's how it works. They will go 1 or 2 kilometers in front of the plane, release flares. The plane's doing 400 kilometers an hour, and it gets very close to the flares. That's what's happened. So you can forget all of the old China's being terrible. This is Chinese airspace. China has a right to defend its airspace. Australia has no right to enter China's airspace without permission, and China have every right to defend against that flight.
Okay, so thank you so much for Jerry, your time. I think my members would very well appreciate your time. So let's give Jerry a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
So
I'm quite open to being reached by email. I'll send you my email. You have my email address, and you can put it into your membership. I'm quite open to being reached by email. I respond to, at least I read all of the comments on all of my videos. It's called Jerry's Take on China on my YouTube. And every time I put a video on there, I get hundreds of comments. I read all of them. And if there are questions there, I respond as best I can. So I'm quite open-minded about this. I respond to all questions reasonable questions. When I get the trolls and the bots and the nasty ones, well, I'm not interested.
Of course,
But
yeah.
if anyone has genuine questions, I'm very, very happy, because I know that China is so badly misunderstood. So I'm happy to answer any questions that your members have.
Thank you so much, Jerry. And then the members will also note that you can do a search on YouTube, Jerry's Take on China, and you can find Jerry's videos. I think you are posting almost at least one video per day. Is that right?
Not quite. I try and go for 2 or 3 a week, but some days I'm heading off on an adventure tour to Laos, basically hiking across Laos in a couple of weeks. I think I'll be off the air for a while, but generally speaking, I try and do 1 or 2 a week.
Okay, so thank you so much. And then for the members here, our second term, I will fix the topic and then we'll let you know through the newsletter. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Jerry, in particular.
Yes,
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Albert. Thank you for facilitating.
Thank you, Albert.
Bye-bye.